Hello everyone, welcome to our channel that takes you on an exciting journey through real-life mysteries and stories solved in the most intriguing ways. If you're a fan of captivating narratives and tales that make you rethink the world around you, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to support us by liking and subscribing so you won't miss any of our new content. We're thrilled to share this special story with you today. The New York Nanny murder, shocking details and dark secrets behind the killing of the Krim children. In the heart of New York City, where the lights shine bright and the streets never sleep, a crime occurred that shook the community to its core and raised many questions. A nanny, once trusted by an entire family, suddenly turned into a cold-blooded killer overnight. What happened to the woman who was considered a member of the family? How did she dare commit such a heinous crime against two innocent children? This story is not just an isolated incident, it's a journey into the depths of evil and regret. Join me as we dive into this gripping report on the crime that shocked everyone, revealing terrifying details and secrets that no one could have predicted. The Krim family lived in New York City, their home located in the upscale neighborhood of Manhattan. Their social and professional lives were normal until the tragic event that changed everything. Carl Krim, father. In 2012, Carl was around 40 years old. He worked as an executive at a major company in New York, managing a team in the business and marketing sectors. He worked long hours, which led him to focus more on his career. His social life involved attending business and family events, but he always sought to balance this with personal time with his family. He was known for his good relationships with his colleagues and close friends. Louise Krim, mother. Louise was around 38 years old in 2012. She was a university professor in the academic field at a prestigious university in New York, specializing in social sciences or literature. She had a good reputation in her field. Her social life was filled with academic and teaching events, and she made sure to interact with her students and colleagues. Despite her busy work schedule, she always found time to spend with her children and husband. Leo Krim, child. Leo was 6 years old in 2012. He attended elementary school and was known for his intelligence and energy. He loved participating in sports, especially soccer and swimming, and had friends in the neighborhood. He participated in school activities like field trips and theatrical performances and was known as a social and friendly child. Lucia Krim, child. Lucia was only 2 years old at the time of the crime in 2012. She was still in early childhood. She received a great deal of care from her parents and the nanny, who looked after her while they were away. She had a personality full of innocence and curiosity, and she enjoyed daily playtime at home. Their social life. The Krim family had an active social life in their community. They had a wide circle of friends and colleagues from work and people they met through various social activities. They were known for their good character and their cooperation with their neighbors. The family was also committed to spending time together, whether at home or during holidays. They participated in cultural events in the city, such as attending art performances and theater shows. There was a balance between their professional and social lives, but the tragic incident that occurred in 2012 destroyed their normal life entirely, changing the family forever. Yoselyn Ortega was a woman filled with anger and bitterness toward a life that didn't meet her expectations. Born in the Dominican Republic in 1989, she grew up in a poor and harsh environment, living with a family struggling to make ends meet. She quickly became frustrated with her situation and decided to migrate to the United States in search of a better life. However, in New York, instead of finding happiness, she found herself trapped in a cycle of frustration, working in modest and exhausting jobs as a nanny and housekeeper. Her life in New York was filled with isolation and loneliness, living in a small apartment in Brooklyn, far from any social or familial support. Her relationships with those around her were superficial, and she had no real friends. She felt like an outcast, unable to improve her financial situation, which made her spiral into feelings of hatred toward everyone. These negative feelings intensified as she began working with the Krim family. She observed the comfortable life they led and noticed how their children lived in a world of love and comfort. This increased her feelings of jealousy and resentment toward them. She couldn't bear the idea that others had a much better life than she did, which started to fill her heart with anger. She carried in her heart feelings of revenge, hiding under the surface an angry person seeking to hurt everyone around her. Over time, as psychological and financial pressures built up, these feelings turned into a desire to harm others. She had no empathy, only a deep sense of entitlement and frustration that drove her to take destructive actions. When she decided to kill the children, it was not just a random act, but the result of a buildup of hatred and revenge she had been grappling with. She felt no remorse or guilt after committing the crime. On the contrary, she felt she had avenged herself against a world that had always been harsh toward her. She considered what she did as a reaction to a life she believed was unfair, and she saw herself as the victim, now ready for vengeance. At the beginning of 2012, Yoselyn Ortega started working for the Krim family as a nanny. She had moved to New York several years earlier to work in various jobs, and when she met the family, she was looking for an opportunity to improve her financial situation. She started working with them and appeared to be a polite and understanding nanny. The family was in need of a trusted person to look after their children, and they thought she would be a great addition to their lives. She appeared kind, smiling, and very caring toward the children. She always presented herself as professional and attentive to her duties, which made the family feel very comfortable with her. She showed nurturing behavior toward the children, caring for them as though she was part of the family. At first, there was nothing to cause concern or raise suspicions, and she treated the children with warmth and care. As time passed, the family began to notice some subtle changes in Yoselyn's behavior. Although she made an effort to maintain a calm and respectful demeanor, there was something hidden behind her calm exterior. They began to sense a certain tension and withdrawal in her actions. At first, they ignored these changes, thinking they were just temporary. Yoselyn continued to interact with the children normally, but something in her behavior was raising questions in the family members' minds, though they couldn't pinpoint the reason. Her life with the family was running smoothly at first, but it became apparent that there was something deep inside her, something no one could see on the surface. Yoselyn Ortega contemplated committing the crime because of deep emotional and psychological turmoil she was living through. She had grown up in a poor family in the Dominican Republic and endured a life full of struggles and hardships. When she moved to New York, she hoped to improve her financial and social standing, but found herself trapped in modest jobs, working long hours as a nanny and housekeeper, only to feel trapped in a cycle of isolation and frustration. Over time, Yoselyn began to feel bitter and resentful of a life she felt was unfair. Everything in her life seemed unjust. She lived in a city full of opportunities, but couldn't find a place for herself. She constantly felt let down, watching others around her live comfortable, successful lives while she struggled to make ends meet. This sense of despair built up inside her. When she started working with the Krim family, she began to feel hatred and anger at their easy, comfortable life. She saw how the parents cared for their children and how the children were loved and cared for in a way she didn't have. She watched them with jealousy, and this feeling grew over time. Her daily life was filled with loneliness and isolation, while she saw this family living in a completely different world. Her life was full of bitterness and psychological pressure, and as this feeling of injustice grew, her desire for revenge on everyone intensified. Under the weight of her emotional and psychological struggles, Yoselyn reached a point where she could no longer handle the anger and hatred inside her. She felt completely helpless before the world, and committing the crime seemed like the only way to express everything that had been building up inside her. Before committing her horrific crime, Yoselyn Ortega had spent several days suppressing her emotions. In her heart, the anger and hatred grew every day. Her life in New York was filled with loneliness and difficulties, and her eyes would secretly wander to the comfortable life of the Krim family. Each time she looked at the children, the feeling of envy consumed her heart. How could they have everything, while she lived in isolation, struggling to survive deep inside? A voice told her, "If you can't get what you deserve, then take what you want." As the day of the crime approached, Yoselyn knew there was no better time than now to execute her plan. While the parents were out, busy with their personal lives, the opportunity was finally in her hands. In the days leading up to the incident, she was preparing mentally. Every detail was carefully planned in her mind. She had chosen the perfect moment, knowing that the parents' absence meant no one would stop her. On that fateful morning, she waited eagerly for the moment to break the norm. She crept quietly inside the house, feeling deep within her that this was the right time, the moment when she would take what no one could give her. The children, who were playing peacefully, had no idea their final moments were upon them. In a moment the Krim family never expected, everything was over. Yoselyn had set her plan in motion, transforming into someone completely different from the calm Nanny the family once knew. On the tragic day that Yoselyn Ortega had meticulously planned everything, the events unfolded in a chilling silence. She watched the children, Leo and Lucia, in their apartment, waiting for their parents' return. The family had gone out for some time, which made Yoselyn feel that she finally had control. There was a moment of calm as the children played safely in their home, but in Yoselyn's heart, a storm of anger and bitterness raged. With great caution, she approached the two children, who had no idea what fate awaited them. Yoselyn's eyes were dark, filled with hatred and anger toward the world. In a moment of intense nervous tension, her hand moved toward the knife she had hidden earlier. The knife gleamed coldly under the light, and it was as if she no longer felt the passage of time or space. Her heart raced, but she knew what she had to do. With light steps, she moved closer to Leo, who was engrossed in his toy, while Lucia, the young child, played nearby. In an instant, Yoselyn grabbed the knife and drove it into Leo's body. The movement was swift, yet sinister, as though she had transformed into a merciless monster. At first, Leo was in shock. His eyes widened in terror, but he couldn't escape or understand what was happening. He felt immense pain and tried to run, but Yoselyn pursued him relentlessly. In that moment, Lucia felt fear and ran toward her brother, trying to understand what was happening. Her eyes were full of innocence, but that wasn't enough to stop what transpired. Yoselyn moved quickly, chasing the young child, and once again, her hand reached for the knife. Within seconds, the crime was complete. Everything was over. Yoselyn had done what she planned, but in that moment, as she looked into the faces of the children, filled with fear and blood, she felt something strange inside her. There was no remorse, only a deep feeling that what she had done was a step toward revenge, a way to take what she believed she deserved. But as she left the scene, there was something else in her heart, something she couldn't escape, the fear of what would happen when everyone discovered the crime. She had committed a horrendous act that could not be undone, but now she understood that there was no turning back. When Carl and Louise Krim returned to their apartment that afternoon, the atmosphere was unusually quiet. But something inside felt off. They entered the house, talking about their day, when they suddenly stopped at the door, noticing an eerie silence, unlike the usual laughter and noise of their children. Carl was the first to enter the room, but he stopped at the horrifying scene he never expected. There were bloodstains on the floor, and his heart sank. He rushed toward the children's room, his mind struggling to process everything in the fleeting moments. Everything seemed blurry, as if time had stopped in that moment. He entered the room to find the worst, Leo, his 6-year-old son, lying on the floor, his eyes wide with terror, still unblinking, while little Lucia was nearby, her lifeless body drenched in blood. The nightmares he had never imagined had become a terrifying reality. He screamed at the top of his lungs, but the screams went unheard in the dark home. Louise rushed in behind him, and when she saw the scene, the ground seemed to shake beneath her feet as she struggled to believe what her eyes were seeing. Her heart crawled into her throat, and words became an obstacle as only the terrifying silence filled the air. She was caught between shock, fear, and panic, unsure what to do first. Carl quickly called the police, but it was too late. There was no chance for survival, as the children had already passed away. As the police rushed to the scene, the investigation began to unfold with disturbing details. While the parents were in denial, feeling helpless before the crime committed, Yoselyn had vanished completely from the scene. In those moments, the pain was indescribable, and regret consumed the family's heart. There was nothing that could bring their children back, and a strange feeling engulfed them, as if the family had been shattered in an instant. After committing her horrific crime, Yoselyn Ortega's initial calmness felt like a storm that passed, but the consequences were more terrifying than she had ever anticipated. In the first moments after killing the children, Yoselyn was eerily calm, as if she had detached from her body, feeling none of the emotions one would expect after such an act. She rushed to the door, locking it behind her, as thoughts scrambled in her mind. She felt a surge of mixed emotions: revenge and emptiness. There was no regret, only a feeling of liberation, as though she had finally achieved what had been missing from her life. She quickly left the apartment, avoiding anyone who might see her, as though every step she took pushed her further away from the crime she had committed. She walked through the crowded streets of New York, blending in with the masses, but she felt a deep sense of fear haunting her. She had committed an act from which there was no turning back, and she knew time was not on her side. Her heart raced, unsure of how things would unfold, but she hoped everything would pass unnoticed. In the days that followed the crime, Yoselyn hid in constant fear. Her eyes were always scanning her surroundings, as if everyone in the city was suspecting her. She didn't contact anyone or go to work. She hid in a small apartment in a distant neighborhood, feeling as though every movement could expose her whereabouts. Each moment felt like living in a nightmare, and she wondered how she could escape the crime she had committed. As time passed, the media and newspapers began covering the horrific crime. The news spread rapidly, and the name Krim became associated with the tragedy that shook the city. In those moments, Yoselyn realized that her escape was not enough and that she would be hunted forever. When the news about the horrific crime spread, the media and newspapers in New York were engulfed like a storm. Headlines screamed out, like cries of pain with no place for relief. Nanny turns killer, a shocking crime shakes the community, was one of the main headlines that brought unspeakable shock to everyone who read it. The newspapers, accustomed to writing about various cases, were unable to convey the scale of terror caused by this crime. No one could imagine that a woman who had once been a trusted figure in an entire family could transform into such a brutal person. Leo and Lucia, victims of fatal trust, was another headline reflecting the deep gap between the trust the parents had placed in the woman they had cared for and the horrific act she committed. Local media were intensely following the details of the case. Journalists visited the crime scene repeatedly, reporting on the destruction and bloodstains that stained the Krim home, where the story began to unfold. Eyes turned to Yoselyn Ortega, the nanny who had worked with the family for a short period, with the biggest question being, how could someone who seemed so kind commit such a brutal act? Reports about her past life were attempts to understand the roots that led her to commit this crime. The newspapers didn't just recount what happened but tried to understand the deeper causes, pointing to her difficult life in the Dominican Republic, the poverty she suffered, and the isolation she felt in New York. There was a common feeling among readers that they had never truly known Yoselyn. This dark side of her personality was hidden until the very last moment. However, despite the media's attempts to understand the cause, there was another element that surfaced: anger. People everywhere talked about the crime, and emotions ranged from shock to pain. How could someone like Yoselyn kill innocent children? These were the questions on everyone's minds. Meanwhile, the Krim family was surrounded by a sea of questions, and images of their brave children who didn't choose their fate flooded every newspaper and TV screen. The newspapers shared in the grief mixed with anger, and the impact of the words on the page was stronger than ever, as the Krim family had lost something irreplaceable, and the media shared the deep sorrow that had engulfed the community. After the police discovered the horrific crime in the Krim apartment, investigations began quickly to locate the killer. The first clue was Yoselyn Ortega's statement that she was the last person to leave with the children before the parents discovered the crime. But what surprised the investigators was her disappearance after the incident. There were no traces of her in any of the usual places she might have been. Yoselyn's steps were traced through her phone records, revealing that she had unexpectedly left the area after the crime, heading to another neighborhood far from the crime scene. The police monitored the patterns and places she visited, but Yoselyn was careful to remain unseen, avoiding places that could have been pivotal in capturing her. In the days following the crime, the FBI began collaborating with local police to search for Yoselyn on a larger scale. Her photo was released in the media, and her name became known in local and international news. Rewards were offered for any information that could lead to her whereabouts. The threads leading to Yoselyn appeared intermittently, but the breakthrough came when her bank accounts and credit cards were traced, revealing that she had used one of them in a small store in a remote part of the city. This was the crucial point that led to her being found. Immediately, investigative teams headed to the location, and there, in a small apartment in a distant neighborhood, Yoselyn was found hiding. She hadn't expected to be tracked so quickly. Her eyes were filled with fear when she was arrested, as if every moment of her escape had been running toward the inevitable moment of capture. During the initial investigations, Yoselyn confessed to the crime, and the details of how she committed the crime slowly began to unfold. However, despite this, there was no remorse in her words. She described what happened as if she felt no regret for what she had done. The morning after Yoselyn Ortega was arrested, she was taken to the interrogation room at the police station. The bright lights and the tense atmosphere in the room stirred a sense of anxiety in her heart. Detective Jonathan Miller, who was leading the investigation, sat at the table across from her. Yoselyn, exhausted and with tired eyes, tried to appear unaffected by what was happening around her. She wore the blue prison uniform, her slouched posture reflecting the internal breakdown she was feeling. "You know why you're here, don't you?" Detective Miller asked in a calm but firm voice. Yoselyn looked down at the floor, as if trying to avoid eye contact. She didn't answer at first, but Detective Miller continued to pressure her, presenting the evidence, phone records, surveillance cameras, and the credit cards she had used in the days following the crime. She tried to maintain her composure, but she knew the noose was tightening around her. "Where were you after the incident?" the detective asked sharply. "Yes, we know you fled. We know about the credit card you used at the store. There's no escape." A long silence followed before she answered in a weak voice. "I had no other choice. I was in shock." Detective Miller looked at her directly, waiting for a reaction. "No one believes that, Yoselyn. You were in a position of responsibility, but you chose to kill the children. Why? What happened?" She didn't respond immediately. The pressure was evident on her face, but Detective Miller was not in a rush. He knew that this was the moment when he would get everything. He began to ask the question again, calmly but with a quiet challenge. "You're about to face the consequences of what you've done, but if you're honest with us, it could help with what happens next." Yoselyn took a deep breath, and the anger in her eyes started to build. Finally, she began to confess, "It was hard, I had so much anger inside me. I was living in poverty, in loneliness, and I had this deep sense of injustice. When I saw the children, I couldn't take it anymore. They had everything, and I had nothing. I couldn't control myself." Detective Miller's eyes widened slightly. He had somewhat expected this answer, but he hadn't thought she would admit it so easily. He knew that the story she was telling was just the beginning, and the truth still needed to be uncovered. "You're saying this now, but what happened next? Why didn't you stop?" the detective continued. In that moment, Yoselyn showed signs of remorse, but she also remained composed. She said, "I didn't think. Everything happened quickly. I couldn't stop. Once I started, it was impossible to turn back." Detective Miller pointed to the inevitable outcome. "That's the truth, isn't it? You were angry, weak, and you took revenge. And now, you're facing the consequences." As Yoselyn sat silently, the detective realized that the next stages of the investigation would be more complicated. But at that moment, he had obtained the first emotional confession, which was the key to everything. The investigation with Yoselyn Ortega ended after weeks of intense pressure from the police. During this time, all the evidence and confessions were gathered, making the case clearer. Her confessions in the interrogation room were crucial in proving her full involvement in the crime. However, there were still many details the investigators needed to study, such as phone records, surveillance footage, and testimonies from people who might have seen her movements before and after the crime. At the end of the investigation, the detectives decided that it was time to take the case to court. The charges Yoselyn would face were serious: first-degree murder of 2 innocent children, premeditated planning of the crime, and fleeing the scene to hide after committing the crime. All the necessary documents were prepared and submitted to the prosecutor, who then decided to present the case to court as soon as possible. The trial date was set a few weeks after the investigation concluded, with the media closely following the case, shining a spotlight on the court proceedings. Yoselyn arrived at the courtroom in her prison attire, surrounded by heavy security. Her face was marked by pain and fear, and every movement she made was closely watched by the eyes in the courtroom. The trial officially began on the scheduled day, with the prosecutor presenting the case and evidence against Yoselyn, including her documented confessions. There was a strong focus on how she had treated the children before the crime and the pain she caused the Krim family. The defense was weak at first, attempting to portray Yoselyn as a victim of difficult circumstances, but the strong confessions and gathered evidence undermined every attempt to defend her. The trial lasted several weeks, with more evidence and testimonies being presented. In the end, everyone in the courtroom knew that Yoselyn would face severe punishment, especially after the confirmation of the premeditated murder and the circumstances leading to the crime. After weeks of trial, the legal stage was set, and all eyes were on the judge's decision. Tension filled the courtroom as lawyers, judges, and the Krim family gathered, waiting for justice for their children. The judge's verdict was highly anticipated, and everyone was on edge as the judge began reading the sentence. Yoselyn Ortega sat in her seat, her head lowered, her eyes almost empty of expression, but she knew that this moment would determine her fate. The judge, who had dealt with numerous legal cases, read the verdict in a heavy voice, as if the words themselves were laden with pain. Based on the strong evidence, the painful confessions, and the impact this crime has had on the community and the victim's family, the court finds the defendant, Yoselyn Ortega, guilty of first-degree murder of 2 innocent children. The verdict was handed down: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict shocked those present in the courtroom, but there were whispers among the crowd, with some feeling that justice had been served, while others felt that the sentence was not enough for the family's suffering. Yoselyn tried to maintain calm, but her eyes shifted among the audience, as if searching for an answer or trying to understand what would happen next. There was nothing that could bring back what the family had lost, and that truth sank deeply into her mind. After the verdict was read, Yoselyn was taken into custody under heavy security. In the days that followed, Yoselyn was transferred to a maximum security prison, where her new life as an inmate began. The cells were dark, surrounded by walls that reminded her at every moment of what she had done, and the suffocating silence hung over her daily life. Her days passed in silence and pain, far away from the outside world she would never see again. In prison, Yoselyn wandered through her small cell, hearing echoes of impending danger, while she contemplated the life she had lost. She thought about the children, the moment she decided to put an end to their innocent lives, and the pain that would accompany her forever. As time passed in prison, her loneliness grew. She wished she could turn back time and find a way to undo what she had done, but time does not go backward. Every moment spent in prison revealed to her the depth of the suffering she had brought upon herself and the world around her. In the end, the sentence was carried out, but the regret she felt could not undo what had been lost. Ultimately, Yoselyn Ortega's story remains one of the most tragic tales experienced by society, a story filled with regret and tears, showing us how anger, poverty, and loneliness can destroy innocent lives. But we must all remember that the path to change begins from within, and true strength lies in controlling our emotions and actions, especially in difficult moments. We must not forget that life is fragile, and every action has consequences from which we may not be able to escape. If this story has moved you, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button if you feel this story deserves attention, and subscribe to my channel, The Haunting Truth, to be the first to know about the incredible stories that could change your perspective on life.